Prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Welcome, everybody. Contact information for the show, facebook.com/TOS podcast, on Twitter @TOS_podcast, or either of us individually @Justin Spears 4 or @Mr. Margison. You can also find us online at the Cerberus Radio Network. Strongly encourage you to go over there. There's a lot of great programming there. Or on the radio, WCVL 92.1 FM, 1550 AM. We'll air Saturday mornings at 8. Or you can listen online there, WCVLAM.com. Or if you want to do it the old school way, email margisonandspears@gmail.com. Welcome to the other side. I'm Mr. Margison. I'm here always with Justin Spears, and Justin is ready to go. Full bat suit, Batman mask, and everything. He's answering the call. Justin, how you doing today?
Well, I am fantastic. Yeah. When we designed this episode out, I knew I saw the bat signal go up, and I knew it was DEFCON 4. So we're ready to go tonight. That's for sure.
Good. Today we're going to be talking about the Constitution, specifically constitutional clauses. And look, I know that might sound like a little bit of a snoozer right off the bat, but it is crucially important that you understand this. So stay with us, because every time the government wants to reach their hands deeper into your pockets or put their, grimy little fingers further into your paycheck, they are reliant on your ignorance of the Constitution. These people are totally dependent upon the fact that you don't really understand what they're doing, because they know that you or us, an educated populace, we are the only real check on their abuses of power. There are no checks and balances in our system. I know that's crazy to say, and I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic or alarmist, but the checks and balances that we are taught exist, they actually don't exist, because all you need is the right judge. And let's face it, judges are not robots. They're subject to the exact same emotional influences as you and I. And if there is a judge, for instance, who strongly believes in universal health care, who believes that should be policy in America, well, heck, they'll go and find it in the Constitution, whether it's there or not. It's actually not. But what we can do is we can put legislators out of a job. We can not reelect them. We can never even put them in that position where they can write this unconstitutional legislation and take it before a partisan judge. And I think that scares them more than anything. They want us to be ignorant. And it is upon us to make sure that we know the Constitution. I came across a quote not too long ago. It's from a relatively obscure figure in American history. His name is Ezra Taft Benson. He was the Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight Eisenhower. So this was a while ago. But he says this. He says, "I have faith that the Constitution will be saved, but it will not be saved in Washington, D.C. It will be saved by citizens of this nation who love and cherish freedom. It will be saved by enlightened men and women who will subscribe to and abide by the principles of the Constitution." Now, that is extremely important, you guys. Look, if we want to be free, we cannot be lazy. We have to be vigilant. We need to learn the Constitution, but we also have to insist that it is followed. And if we pass that duty of constitutional interpretation over to the very people who can enrich themselves by misusing it, it's like we're signing our own death warrant. All right, so look, don't turn us off. I promise you this is important. We're going to talk Constitution. And Justin, are you ready to go?
Let's get into it.
All right, I want to start with what I think is the most abused term in the Constitution, and that is the term general welfare. This clause appears twice in the document, once in the preamble, and then again in Article 1, Section 8. And what I want to discuss is, first of all, is there any difference in the meaning between the two terms, given the fact that it appears once in the preamble and then again in Article 1? And what are we to make of this phrase, general welfare? Because really that sounds unlimited.
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely, something that throughout the course of our history, we've had politicians and historians and academics that have debated, what exactly this means. And so, whenever I'm looking at something like this, I always want to go back to the root as close as I can. And I did want to just kind of start off by saying I'm really glad to hear that you brought up the importance of this. I think it's so vital for us to understand how disconnected the public is from this document. You hear the Constitution thrown around on both sides of the political aisle in America today, really being used, to the advantage of whichever side you're on. And you oftentimes hear people lament that, if we could just get back to the Constitution or the founding fathers, and then you hear the other side say, it's an antiquated document. That system existed, 250 years ago. We need to rip it up and start over again. But it is a document that we hear a lot about. And I think oftentimes the reason that maybe that disconnect there is due to the fact that so many people are intimidated by this. You oftentimes hear people referred to as constitutional scholars. And so then there's this kind of image in your mind that, well, gee, I didn't go to school to study the Constitution. Therefore, I can't be knowledgeable on it. What am I going to get out of it? Just, I work at a factory job, or I do this, or I do that. What am I going to know about the Constitution? But it's vitally important for you to understand, because it gives you guidance when you then hear politicians talking about wanting to do A, B, and C, that you should have alarm bells go off and say, wait a second, the document doesn't give you the power to do that, or that's not something that is constitutional. So I was glad to hear you say that. And I think that leads perfectly into understanding these clauses. And so when we start with the general welfare clause, right, and you mentioned it's said twice in detail in the Constitution. Let's start with the preamble, right? And what does the preamble of the Constitution do? It establishes why we have this government. Right. It's basically the founders and the framers looking at this and saying, OK, here's what we lived under the oppression of the monarch, the King of England. And here's what we want out of our government. Here's what government should do. We, the people, right? The government exists because the people allow it to exist. And so a couple of those things that are in there are to secure the blessings of liberty, to provide for the common defense. And then you have this phrase right after that, the general welfare clause. And it was interesting because I was listening to C-SPAN coverage the other day in my classroom while I was eating lunch, and Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio, happened to be on this floor of the Senate, and he's bringing this up, right? He's talking about the preamble, and he's talking about common defense and general welfare as it related to the tragedy in Florida. And so he's going on about, how the government has an obligation and a duty to provide for domestic tranquility and the common defense and the general welfare. And he's kind of going through and talking about, what the government's responsibilities should be with this. But it's always been a phrase that has been kind of used to twist and contort, because it's difficult to define. It's difficult to pinpoint what the general welfare is and what it means. And essentially, the way that the founders would talk about it and write about it is that it is a meaning that the government is going to stay out of the way. When we study liberty in U.S. government class, and I talk about this early on in the trimesters that I teach U.S. government, where I do a foundations unit, and we talk about the whole, movement away from the divine right of kings toward the idea of liberalism. And we talk about positive liberty, negative liberty, and this idea that negative liberty exists to basically allow you as a citizen to be free of interference from the government. Right? Just leave me alone and let me do what I want to do. And so the fact that you can go on to a course of study, for example, at a university and pursue a career path relatively free of interference from the government is an example of negative liberty, right? The fact that you can purchase a plot of land and, again, relatively speaking, you're free to do with it as you wish. Of course, you got permits and all that stuff. But the fact is that the government doesn't own that land and then tells you what you can or cannot do with it. You are free to strike it out on your own. And so that idea of promoting that, right, that the government should be providing an atmosphere where the citizens of this country are free from interference. And this is so vital then to understanding what would be to come in Article 1, which deals with the legislative branch and all of the detailed powers that are laid out of what Congress can do. So again, if you want to grab a copy of the Constitution and read along as we're going through this, pause the show if you're listening to it on replay online, or go grab a copy of it, pull it up online, and read through Article 1, Section 8. And what you'll find there is a list of powers, enumerated powers. Now, I'm going to come back to why that's so important here in just a minute when I talk about the second mention of the General Welfare Clause. But these are powers that are expressly granted to the legislative branch, to the Congress, which at that time, and probably still should be today, was the most powerful branch of our government. I know you'll hear this idea that they're supposed to be co-equal and all that, but the legislature was the one that was tied most closely to the common person. And so the Constitution lays out what Congress can specifically do. And then as it gets to the end, it says, okay, anything that is not listed in here is retained to the states. And then it follows up with a couple of things that the states cannot do in Section 9. And so it's very, very important to understand that the things that were granted to the government to do were to help to promote the general welfare, right? And we see that as so important in looking at the role of government in our lives. Now, I want to get then, as I mentioned just a second ago, to the second mentioning of it, which is actually at the beginning of Article 1, Section 8, where it's talking about the ability of the government to tax, right? And so that was something that didn't exist under the Articles of Confederation. The government did not have the authority to lay and collect taxes, and that was, the big remedy and push for the new government under the Constitution, was to be given the ability and authority to do this. And so that mentioning of the power to lay and collect taxes and duties and imposts, and then to provide for the general welfare. And again, here we kind of have to go back to what we just went through and think, well, okay, what is that? Well, those dollars that are collected through taxation are to then be used in a relatively equal way to help provide for all of the citizens of this country in attaining to what it is, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness charge that is put upon us, that the government is there, again, to help you do that. And so when you look at early on in the nation's history, right, and you think about the spirit of the body of the person who came to this country, it was a unique freedom that they were searching for. It was something that was kind of calling out, saying, we shouldn't live under this despotism. We should be free to go do what we want to do. And even after the establishment of the colonies, and we win our independence, the movement westward is the greatest playing out of this that you can illustrate. People were moving away from government. They were moving out on their own, out into the frontier to be left alone and do what they wanted to do. And again, so long as the government didn't interfere with that, that would be an example of providing for the general welfare. Now, contrast that with how the General Welfare Clause gets used today. The General Welfare Clause today gets used and abused to mean that we need to provide healthcare for citizens, that we need to provide unemployment insurance, that we need to provide food stamps, that we need to provide WIC vouchers, that we need to provide all of these different things to take care of our citizens, which are the absolute opposite of that self-made spirit that we used to have in our country. And it's caused us for two things, really. It's caused us to become dependent upon the federal government. And because of that dependence, we've ceded over a lot of our freedoms and liberties under the guise of the General Welfare Clause, amongst others as well. So that is, in a nutshell, really the impact of the General Welfare Clause and what it has meant to this country over our nation's history.
There's another clause in the Constitution, which it comes up, I believe, also in Article 1, Section 8, and it's been interpreted, I think, in the wrong way to, again, give the government some unlimited power, and this is the necessary and proper clause. Does that mean that our current legislators can just do whatever they want, make whatever laws they want, as long as they think that they are, I guess, quote, necessary and proper?
Well, yeah, I mean that's the modern version of it. If you pay attention to politicians who stand on the House floor, the Senate floor, they certainly are looking for ways in which they can seize on these vague clauses, right? Necessary and proper. What is necessary and proper? If you were to survey a man on the street type survey and ask, you're going to get different input from different people on what's necessary and proper. But the real intent of this, right, was to go back to those enumerated powers, because this is the clause that is contained at the end. I believe I misspoke earlier. This is the clause that's contained at the end of Article 1, Section 8. And essentially, you got to go back to what I mentioned a second ago. The powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 are enumerated in specific powers. And this is where I want to kind of turn to a conversation that I had this past week. I had the privilege of speaking with Mr. Mike Meharry of the 10th Amendment Center, just a fantastic guy, a great mind, and had a chance to interview him on the phone this week. And I was asking him, because he's done some work through the 10th Amendment Center, writing some Constitution 101 documents. I highly encourage you to check those out. You can Google 10th Amendment Center. You can go to MikeMeharry.com. He's got a podcast. He's got another website called godarchy.com. All fantastic resources if you're looking at a entry level look into this stuff. But I was speaking with him about this topic, and he said, look, the necessary and proper clause is really the best way to give you an antidote with this. Is if I were to say to you, I am going to give you the authority to run a grocery store. I own the grocery store, but I want you to be the daily GM, general manager, running operations of this store. Okay, that is the direction that I've given to you. Implied in that, right, is that I'm giving you the authority to order new product when I run out. That I'm giving you the authority to, if a cooler breaks down, get it fixed. I'm giving you the authority to hire and fire employees to make that happen. I'm not going to spell every one of those things out. And even if I did, within that, there's going to be some inherent power that is granted in doing that. So the necessary and proper clause takes those powers that are granted in Article 1, Section 8. For example, to give you a real constitutional example, the power to create the post office is granted to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. But it doesn't specifically say then that they have the ability to regulate it. And it's been decided that because they had the power to create it, they have the power to regulate it. And so, those types of things are what are looked at. But unfortunately, all too often, politicians, being, people who are power-hungry individuals, have seized on this vagueness, even when it seems like it's clearly defined. They've wiggled their way through of being able to seize on more power and opportunity here. And you can just see all throughout the documents that were written during this ratification time of the Constitution. I mean, even Alexander Hamilton himself, in Federalist number 83, writes about the limited power of the federal government as it relates to this Article 1, Section 8 and the general welfare and necessary proper clause. And I want to read part of what he says, because Hamilton is one of these guys that was in favor of a strong executive, a strong national government. He wanted more power consolidated here. And he said, the specification of particulars, meaning the 18 enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, evidently excludes all pretension to a general legislative authority, right? So what is he saying there? He's saying this means they don't have a blank check, right, where they could do whatever they want, because an affirmative grant of special powers would be absurd as well as useless if a general authority was intended. So he's saying, look, this thing is clearly well defined and laid out in Article 1, Section 8, and nobody with their right mind should think that this gives Congress the authority to do whatever they deem necessary and proper. And so again, to kind of wrap it up in thinking about overall impact here, again, I'll go back to something that Mike said to me that resonated with me really well. in our phone interview, where he said, look, this is a contract, right? The states entered into a compact when they created this new government, this new general government. And the people that want to take this document and turn it into a living, breathing document that can be moldable and changeable. He said, think about if you entered into a mortgage this way. Would you enter into a living, breathing mortgage where you could say to the bank, oh, hey, by the way, that interest rate that I agreed on, and we need to renegotiate that because really it's not clearly defined that it's going to be that throughout the entirety of the life of the loan, and circumstances change, and maybe I got a raise, or I lost my job, or something happened, and so I need to renegotiate the terms of this mortgage. And of course we wouldn't do that, right? We wouldn't say we can renege on the terms of what was signed on the dotted line. And so, that is in and of itself something that I think he does a great job of trying to explain and get the people to see in a modern example of what this means. So both of these have been grossly abused to create more power with the general government and therefore take that power from the people.
It would seem to me that you're a government teacher. How do the kids respond to this? Just out of curiosity. I mean, this seems to me like it would be items 1 and 2 if I were teaching the Constitution.
Yeah, I think that overall they understand it, but it doesn't resonate with them, right? It's like one of those things where when you're teaching a concept and they get it, but then it's kind of like, yeah, but you know what? At the end of the day, Netflix still works, and Olive Garden still has breadsticks, and AMC is still showing Black Panther this weekend. So what's the deal here, dude? Like, why are you going on about this? And so that's the complicated matter here of trying to get the general public, or in this case, my students, to really grasp what this means. And so I kind of want to shift gears here and throw it to you for a second, because I think maybe this might be an area where there would be some resonation with what there's an abuse with the Commerce Clause, right? Where there's another clause here that we refer to as the Commerce Clause. And this is where you start looking at how this has impacted business and our economy. So talk us up a little bit here about what this Commerce Clause is, and give us a little bit of insight in here on how the government has abused this clause.
Yeah, the government has grossly misused the Commerce Clause, almost comically misused the Commerce Clause, as I'm going to try and point out here. But commerce is exactly what it sounds like. It's exchange of goods and services. It's trade. And it doesn't mean, the way the modern interpretation now is anything that could kind of possibly conceivably relate to money. And given the fact that money is omnipresent in our lives, basically the government is taking this as, well, under the Commerce Clause, we have the right to literally regulate anything that people do. I want to go through a couple of court cases which actually help clarify this. And I'm going to go back a little bit in time to 1942. This is a court case called Wickard versus Filburn. Roscoe Filburn was a small Ohio farmer. Claude Wickard was the Secretary of Agriculture under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt regime. And under this regime, during the New Deal, the Department of Agriculture told farmers how many crops they were allowed to produce. And they did this so that they could keep prices high, because, of course, during a depression, that's what everybody needs, high food prices. But Roscoe Filburn, this small Ohio farmer, he did the unthinkable. He ignored the government, and he decided how much wheat he thought he should have, and he grew more wheat. But the kicker here is he kept it off of the market, right? So it didn't affect the market price for wheat. He used it for other reasons. He used it to feed his cattle, to feed his poultry. But since it didn't hit the market, it had no impact on the market price of wheat. But guess what? He disobeyed his overlords, and the government came after him, and they charged him. And the government, he said, look, you have no right to tell me that I can't grow wheat and feed it to my cows. And the government argued, yes, we do. We have that right under the Commerce Clause. And they said, it was just so bizarre. So try and pay attention when I'm saying this. The court said, look, first of all, the court, of course, they agreed with the government, but the court says if he hadn't grown the wheat, he then might have had to purchase wheat on the open market, right? And so then if he did that, that might have been an interstate purchase. So the government has the right to regulate it under the Commerce Clause, even though there was no commerce. He grew the wheat and fed it to his cattle, no commerce, but they argued that he didn't have the right to do that under the Commerce Clause. Now, what this does, it seems like a relatively obscure case, but it sets a precedent and cements the government's power. They can regulate our movements under this clause, and look how elastic they made that clause, right? This guy just growing more wheat. Now, for about 50 years, that was pretty much the status quo as far as government regulation under the Commerce Clause. Things did get a little bit better. By the 1990s, this came up again in a high-profile case. The case was the United States versus Lopez, a high school senior in San Antonio, Texas, I believe. He carried a concealed weapon into school. And he was charged by the feds under the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1990. Now, Lopez argued correctly, or at least his lawyers did, that the feds had no right to regulate schools, that only state and local governments had the right to do that. And the government said, no, we can regulate schools under the Commerce Clause. And again, you have to be paying close attention here because the argument is so bizarre. But what they said is, look, safe schools are important to education, and education is important to economic matters. So therefore, Congress can put you in jail for 6 months because it has the ability to regulate commerce. Look, in the 1990s, thankfully, that argument was even too much for the courts. The Rehnquist court voted it down. But imagine this, Justin, it was not a 9-0 case as you might expect it to be. As idiotic as that argument sounds, it wasn't 9-0, it was 5-4. And luckily, we had 5 decent people on the court then. The Supreme Court said no. And in his writing, Justice Rehnquist said, look, if we were to accept the government's argument, then we are hard-pressed to posit any activity by an individual that Congress is without the power to regulate. And that's absolutely true. If you take this Commerce Clause and you treat it like a rubber band and you just expand it to include anything that might loosely relate to the idea of commerce, well, then, yeah, you can regulate how I work, where I work, what I do, what I produce, what I don't produce. I mean, it's never ending.
You mean like forcing you to have to buy health insurance?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Imagine that if the government said, look, we have the right to tell you that you must buy a private product. This was interesting. Quick side note. God, I can't remember who. I think it was Tom Coburn of Oklahoma asked Ellen Kagan straight, look, do you believe that under the Commerce Clause, the government has the right to tell somebody that they need to eat 3 vegetables a day? And Supreme Court Justice Kagan, she said, yes, I do. I mean, this is unbelievable. The government has the right to tell us to eat vegetables under the Commerce Clause. Stunning. Okay, what does this clause say? Its actual reading is, it gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That's it. It's very straightforward, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So again, the main question becomes, what does the word commerce mean? I'm not going to subject you to what I think it should mean or go back and try and find what they say it means. Look, directly here from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says the buying and selling of goods, especially on a large scale and between different places, trade. And then if you go on to dictionary.com, you're pretty much going to get the exact same verbatim. It means trade. And legal scholars, look, they've looked at notes from the state ratifying conventions. They've read through the Federalist Papers and have concluded that there is absolutely no interpretation of commerce other than trade. It's not mentioned. So very clearly what they meant, what the framers meant here, was that the government had the ability to regulate trade between the states and trade between the United States and foreign nations. Because under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no ability really to tax. I don't think that that's such a bad thing, but they really didn't have the ability to prevent New Jersey from keeping, New York's goods out of their state, or to putting high tariffs on them. And so in the spirit of the clause, they wrote the clause, it was to, well, first of all, to raise revenue, but more importantly, to keep a free trade zone among the states. In other words, the framers understood that anything impeding free trade and free enterprise was detrimental to the overall economy. And that's true. That's why here in Indiana, we can sell our products, our predominant products like corn, freely to Nevada, and they can take their predominant products like precious metals, gold and silver, and sell them back to us. And there's not these obnoxious tariffs put on them. It's just a free exchange of goods and services. It's better for the overall economy. But nowhere, I mean, nowhere is there any indication that the clause was meant to give Congress the power to regulate anything related to commerce, because in the end, you know, that could literally be anything.
Wow. Yeah. Well said. And let that sink in for the listeners out there, kind of leave you with that. Think about all the different ways that the government interjects into commerce using that clause. That's going to have to wrap it up for us this week. If you're listening to us online, we're going to carry this conversation over. If you're listening to us on air on 92.1 1550, we're going to leave it off with that for now. Please make sure you come back next week. We're going to be talking about the white supremacy lunacy that has kind of come up in the media these days. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where we're going to kind of talk a little bit about what this really means and the implications of it. So we appreciate you joining us this week on 1550 and 92.1. We'll see you again on the other side. All right, Mike, for our audience that has listened on our YouTube channel, let's continue the conversation here a little bit. I want to give you an opportunity just to any last thoughts that you had there related to the Commerce Clause. I really like how you were mentioning there, the definition of commerce, right, being trade, because really what has gone on is there's been an abuse where it gives the long arm of the government the ability to regulate production, distribution, manufacturing of the products that are a part of commerce. And the way that the Supreme Court has interpreted a lot of cases, it is given the government that authority. What are some examples that the listeners might think of, or that they might dig into here a little bit? Is there anything that comes to mind where you see this?
Well, look, I mean, it's anything. If they can establish a federal minimum wage because a wage is a part of commerce, I mean, anything that you can think of, if you use an elastic meaning of the Commerce Clause, then the government can regulate it. And that's really the problem, is the difference between broad and narrow interpretation. And when you get into this philosophy, you were talking earlier about the Constitution being a living, breathing document. That's the most broad interpretation of the document. And there are people who believe that, look, whoever's in charge at the time and whenever it is, you just change the interpretation like the blowing wind. Look, clearly we have to take the words for what they mean and interpret them that way. There should be a constructionist, narrow interpretation of what this says, because you can imagine all of the problems that are going to exist as we just go through, from generation to generation. There is no solid foundation if we're just going to keep, shifting it. If this is just a malleable document and these words don't mean anything, then the implications are going to be pretty scary the further we get into the future.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I love how you talked earlier about setting the precedent. And we're wrapping up our trimester right now with the judicial branch. And we just spent a couple of days reading through stare decisis and strict constructionism, originalism versus activism. And I think the kids were able to kind of latch on to some landmark court cases and kind of see, the lasting effect of what this does. And, the essentially, like you mentioned, the elasticity of these clauses and what they can do for stretching out power. And the other thing that I try to get my students to understand, and I hope the average listener can understand this as well, is, I always talk about a pie of power. Right? The power is not infinite. There's not just an unlimited amount of authority that you can have. Even if you were to use a social contract theory where you say, okay, I'm going to give up some of my freedom and liberty for the government to exist to provide safety and security. There's only so much that can be exchanged there on both sides, right? I mean, it ends when the government is so oppressive that it kills me, and it's on the other end where there is no government and we live in a state of anarchy. So somewhere in between there, we're kind of fluctuating on the amount of freedom and liberty I have over the ownership of my life versus what I give to the government to provide security, safety, and those things that we talked about in the preamble. And so I said, you guys have got to understand this. As the government has become more powerful over time, that power has had to come from somewhere. And it's come from us as the general public giving it up to the national government. And so, I always use the example of flying through the airport where, you go through all these different checkpoints and TSA agents and NSA and all the justification for why we have to be patted down and strip searched and all this stuff. We're giving away that freedom and liberty to just park our car, walk into a building, board a plane, and fly free of interference from being felt up and harassed. And so that same mentality has to be carried through with all of these other things. And these clauses are the vehicle for allowing that to happen. Now, I want to ask you one more thing here before we wrap up for our online listeners. Shoot us a little bit here on this supremacy clause. This is one of the other clauses in the Constitution toward the end. I believe it's Article 6 that the Supremacy Clause is contained in. This has been used as justification for why the federal government can smack down the states. I think this was one of John Marshall's favorite clauses to use when he was justice on the Supreme Court. So chat us up a little bit about the Supremacy Clause and how it's been used.
Okay, so the people who do not believe in states' rights love the Supremacy Clause because if you interpret it, the shallowest interpretation of it is, listen, if a state makes a law, the government can just go ahead and make a law and it supersedes it immediately, automatically, end of story. And that is not true. The Supremacy Clause says that any laws made by the federal government pursuant to the Constitution. Now, if you get in an argument with a leftist who really wants the Constitution to be whatever it is that they want it to be, they always leave out, if they're arguing on behalf of the Supremacy Clause, they always leave out the words pursuant to the Constitution. That is the most important part of this clause because what it says is, yes, look, if you do make a law within the power that we gave you, then it will supersede a law made by the states. But it certainly doesn't mean that you can just make any law that you want. It means you can make any law under the powers that we have laid out for you. And those powers are clearly laid out in the Constitution. So this came up, well, okay, how about the marijuana laws, right? The federal government is telling, I don't know, Jeff Sessions is, he wants to take on Colorado and California, and there's more of them now, Washington. And listen, I'm not, I don't smoke marijuana. I never have planned to. This is not something that interests me. But where in the Constitution does it give Congress the right to regulate this? It doesn't. And so that's a perfect example of something that is not pursuant to the Constitution, a law that is not pursuant to the Constitution. We also saw this when Arizona tried to make their own laws since, hey, they're right on the border with Mexico and immigration is affecting them and their economy and their society. So they tried to make laws curbing immigration and the Fed said, no, you can't do that. We're in charge here. I mean, it's just a complete obliteration of the 10th Amendment, blowing it up. It doesn't even exist. And they argue this on behalf of the Supremacy Clause. If the government says it, then it supersedes anything you do. And it's just a misinterpretation and misuse of a very important clause. Look, pursuant to the Constitution, it just reiterates that you can only do, if you're in DC, you can only do what the framers laid out for you. And it's very specific, very narrow, and very clear in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a great call. I really like how you mentioned there the pursuant to, because here again, so many people just see the federal government as, if you think of like a hierarchy. I try to tell people all the time, the general government was created by the states. It was a compact where this thing didn't exist and the states created it. And they were very careful in making sure that, especially the anti-federalists, in making sure that their power at a state level was going to be maintained, and that the only action that the general government would have would be those that are clearly defined and laid out in the Constitution. And so, when you see these different clauses in here that have been abused and misused over our nation's history, it's frustrating. It really is. And I know that in some ways, a lot of the struggles that we've gone.
Sorry to cut you off, but you know what's more frustrating to me even than that is that nobody cares.
Right, absolutely. And what would it take to get people to care about it? And I think the unfortunate thing is that as we've faced some adversities in our nation's history, the lazy, and I don't misuse that. I'm not using that word, I'm using that intentionally. Lazy approach is to turn to the federal government and say, solve this problem. I mentioned at the outset of the program, when talking about the General Welfare Clause, that you had our ancestors that came to this country that were looking for nothing else other than for the federal government to get out of the way. Don't get in my way. Let me do what I want to do and make my own way, self-determined, choose my own path. I might fail at it. I might not. But if I do, who bears the responsibility? Me. Who bears the fruit of if I succeed? Me. And so, unfortunately, as we struggled through some rough patches in our nation's history, we became lazy. We became compliant, and we turned to the general government and said, here's a problem, fix this, right? I just this afternoon, earlier today, had an opportunity in talking to my economics class to talk about the early 1900s, where there was this kind of sense among the country that people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Chase, they were evil. They were robber barons. They had made it off the backs of individuals. And I said, look, the bottom line is, nobody held a gun to those guys' head and say, go do this, go build this. And they certainly didn't hold a gun to somebody else's head and say, do this for me. There were voluntary exchanges that took place. And yes, they were successful at it, and they should have been compensated justly for it. We did not need the national government to come in and break up monopolies or trust bust or institute work hours. The market would have handled all that. And when you then fast forward and look at all the other times in our nation's history where we've relied on the federal government to problem solve for us, that's given them the authority to claim that Supremacy Clause is the justification for doing it.
It's absolutely right. And it's a slow erosion of liberties. And you were talking about I'm using this in quotes, not my words, robber barons. What happened to the people? They got cheaper steel. And then anything and everything that was made with steel and would eventually be made with steel, skyscrapers. Was there a single skyscraper before Carnegie? No. Look at the 1870s, 1880s, started shooting up in New York and Chicago, everywhere. All of these goods, oil, Rockefeller, this stuff got cheaper. It improved the average person's life. I mean, but like you said, yeah, at the turn of the century, when people started turning to the government and saying, oh my gosh, how dare they get rich? That's when the laziness set in. And that's when, look, it's also a point in history where we start to see the progressive era and Teddy Roosevelt and the FDA and the creation of, well, you have to have the government solve these problems because nobody else will do it on their own. It's just false.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope this has provided the listener with at least a starting point. We encourage you, jump into the Constitution, take it on and read it. There are parts of it that you may have to read a couple of times. Find an annotated version.
Yeah, there's guides that go along with it that help explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the few things that I like about our textbook at school is that it breaks it down in the margin to kind of give the student an overall sense as to what the topic is and what's being discussed. But don't be intimidated by it. Don't be lazy about it. Don't rely on what we say or what Fox or CNN or whoever has to say about it. Read it for yourself and determine what am I to make of this, and ask questions and just keep learning about it. Because I think it's so important, as you said, Mike, that, our federal government, when you think about the legislature, Congress has about, depending on who you listen to, about a 10% approval rating, yet a 90% reelection rate. And I use this as the defining essential question in my legislative branch unit. Why is that happening? And one of the main reasons is because we are disengaged. There's no other way that you can explain why you would say you approve of the job that they're doing 10% of the country, but yet we reelect those same people to that as the standard bearer. Why? You wouldn't let that fly in any other part of your life. Why do we let it fly with our elected officials? So we've got to be engaged. We've got to know what's going on. And I really encourage you guys to take a look at that. So Mike, any last comments before we wrap up?
No, hey, next week, everyone's a white supremacist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're gonna take that one on and talk a little bit about some of the lunacy that as we were talking about earlier this week, yoga is now.
Yes, you do yoga. I don't, so I'm not good there.
I could check that box off, but yeah, I'm sure some of the statements that I've probably made or some of the opinions I hold would classify me as a white supremacist, I'm sure. So yeah, we'll take that on next week. But until then, we appreciate you guys being with us. Again, feel free to reach out to us on our social media platforms, our email. Hey, pass the show along to somebody. If you are listening to this and you like what you hear and you think somebody else might enjoy it as well, feel free to share this along. Subscribe on the YouTube page. And again, we appreciate your time, and we'll catch you on the other side.